Behind every smile that leaves the clinic, a darkness lingers, hidden from the world outside. The polished walls and friendly faces hide secrets no one dares to uncover. At the heart of it all, there's a basement forgotten, neglected, and filled with whispers that have been growing louder with each passing day. For years, strange things have happened, small disturbances no one can explain. But when one person finally dares to face the eerie sensations creeping in, the truth begins to surface. What starts as a curiosity soon becomes a descent into terror. A chilling presence begins to make itself known, as if the very foundation of the building itself is alive, waiting for the right moment to strike. And once that moment comes, nothing will ever be the same again. Some secrets were never meant to be uncovered, especially when they've been buried for so long. In the heart of Miami, amidst the shimmering skyline and bustling streets, stood an elegant, two-story building tucked away on a quiet corner. From the outside, it was a picture of modern sophistication, glass windows that caught the sun's rays just right, manicured hedges lining the entryway, and a welcoming sign that read, Dr. Abigail Clark, Pediatric Dentistry. The clinic had a reputation for excellence, a place where children left with smiles, their fears of the dentist soothed by Dr. Clark's renowned gentle touch. Parents flocked to her, grateful for the way she made even the most anxious child feel at ease. Dr. Clark was well known not just in Miami, but throughout the state of Florida. Her name was synonymous with trust and skill. With a warm smile and a kind demeanor, she had worked tirelessly to build the successful clinic that had allowed her to live comfortably. Yet, behind the polished exterior and impeccable reputation, there was a darkness that no one knew about. A darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of her clinic down in the basement, where no one ventured. The basement was always off limits to patients, staff, and even Dr. Clark's colleagues. Most of them had never given it a second thought. It was just an old space beneath the clinic, a place for storage. But for Dr. Clark, the basement had always been something more, a place where memories, both forgotten and repressed, had gathered like dust in the corners. It hadn't always been like this. In the early days of her practice, the basement had been a refuge. After long hours treating children, especially the difficult cases, Dr. Clark would retreat to the basement to unwind. It was quiet, private, and out of sight from the world. She would sit in the old leather chair she had dragged down there, closing her eyes and listening to the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. It was her escape, her sanctuary from the pressures of the job and the world around her. But the peace she once found there slowly started to erode. At first, it was small things, just a few odd sounds here and there that she could easily dismiss as part of the building settling. The occasional creak, the whisper of something brushing against the floor. Dr. Clark tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the natural noises of an old structure. After all, the building had been standing for decades, well before her practice had taken over. But over time, the disturbances became more pronounced. Whispers in the dark, scratching sounds coming from beneath the walls. One night, she was sure she heard footsteps in the basement, the distinct sound of someone walking slowly, deliberately across the floor. When she went down to check, there was nothing. The room was empty, just as it had been before. Yet the air felt wrong. It felt heavy, oppressive, as though something unseen was watching her, waiting. Despite her unease, Dr. Clark pushed the thoughts from her mind. She had a thriving practice to maintain, after all. Her patients needed her. The kids needed her. She couldn't afford to be distracted by a few strange noises in the basement. But then came the night when everything changed. It was a particularly long day at the clinic, and Dr. Clark was still at her desk, finishing up some paperwork when she heard it again. The sound of footsteps, not the random creaks of an old building settling, but purposeful, rhythmic, deliberate. She froze. The sound was coming from the basement. Her heart raced in her chest as she stood up and grabbed the flashlight from her desk drawer. There was no one else in the clinic, just her and the night staff, who had all left hours ago. Dr. Clark told herself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon had gotten inside the building, or perhaps it was the pipes or some other innocent cause. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was waiting for her down there. With hesitant steps, Dr. Clark made her way to the basement door. As her hand gripped the cold brass handle, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The whispers grew louder, closer. They beckoned her, urging her to come inside. Her breath caught in her throat as she opened the door, the familiar creak of the old hinges sounding unnervingly loud in the silence of the building. The basement was dark, even with the light from the hallway spilling through the doorway. Dr. Clark turned on her flashlight and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the stale scent of old cardboard boxes and forgotten medical supplies hanging in the air. She scanned the room, her light bouncing off the cluttered shelves and empty storage bins. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. She moved deeper into the basement, her footsteps soft against the worn concrete floor. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she walked toward the corner of the room, where she thought the sounds had come from. The shadows seemed to shift and dance at the edges of her vision, though when she turned to look, there was nothing there. And then she saw it. A small wooden chest sat in the corner of the basement. It wasn't there before. Dr. Clark was certain of it. The chest was old antique, even and looked out of place among the modern supplies. There was no reason for it to be here. As she approached, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched, the weight of unseen eyes on her back. Her heart pounded in her chest as she knelt down beside the chest. Her flashlight flickered, casting brief moments of darkness, but she didn't care. She opened the lid slowly, her hands trembling as she revealed what was inside. The chest was filled with papers, old, yellowed papers. The pages were crinkled, some torn at the edges, but the text on them was still legible. Dr. Clark's name was written on the top of the first page. Her breath hitched as she scanned the rest of the document. It was a medical report, a list of procedures, but the descriptions were cryptic, and the names listed alongside hers were unfamiliar. The further she read, the more she felt the walls closing in around her. The procedures detailed in the papers were not ones she had ever performed. They spoke of strange, experimental treatments involving children, treatments that should have never taken place in her clinic. Her stomach churned as she flipped through the pages. The names of the children were hauntingly familiar patients she had treated over the years, many of whom had disappeared. Children who had been there one day, and the next their parents were left with no explanation. The whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't just in her mind, they were real. She could hear them all around her, rising from the shadows, urging her to understand. "Abigail, you have to remember." Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as the light from her flashlight flickered and sputtered. The whispers turned into voices, soft, pleading voices that seemed to come from all directions. Dr. Clark's heart raced as she spun around, searching for the source of the voices. And then, in the corner of the room, she saw it. A figure, pale and translucent, standing motionless in the shadows. It was a child no older than 6, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. "Help me," the child whispered. Dr. Clark's mind raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she backed away from the apparition. She had to get out. She had to leave. But the child stepped forward, its outstretched hand reaching for her. "Help me, Abigail, you were part of this." The basement door rattled violently as though something or someone was trying to break through. Dr. Clark's legs buckled, and she collapsed to the floor. The voices in her head were deafening now, the memories flooding back. The experiments. The children. The horror she had buried deep within herself. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the world around her went dark. When she awoke, she was lying on the basement floor, the chest of papers still beside her. The whispers were gone, but so was the child. The basement was silent once more. Dr. Clark didn't know how much time had passed. But she knew one thing for certain: she could never return to the basement again. Whatever dark history had taken place, there was no longer hers to bear. She had to leave. But the whispers, they would follow her, and the children, they would never forget. As the truth begins to unravel, the line between the living and the dead blurs, leaving nothing but unanswered questions and a chilling reality that cannot be ignored. What was once a sanctuary now feels like a prison as the past claws its way to the surface. The whispers and the shadows are just the beginning, and the horrors that lie beneath are far darker than anyone could have imagined. But some stories are never meant to be told, especially when they hold the power to destroy everything. If you've made it this far, you're just scratching the surface of what's to come. I don't let this mystery slip away. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned as we continue to uncover the unsettling truth lurking in the darkest corners. The journey is far from over, and trust us, you won't want to miss what happens next.